A warm welcome along to day 2 of Leasehold Made Simple week, where we are joined by leasehold expert Ian Mitchell, who is partner at Anthony Gold Solicitors here in London. And we are deep diving into the topic of leasehold, very actually trending at the moment, Ian, with so much going on in the leasehold sector. And one of the things that, of course, has really made the media headlines is the ground rent scandal. And we're going to talk about that in this video. What actually has caused this scandal?
Well, it's the scandal. Awareness of the scandal has been running for about 3-4 years, but it's existed for probably 20-25 years. It's been caused by landlords and developers writing enormous sums of ground rent into leases. The scandal and the ploy is essentially they'll set the rent at what seems to be an acceptable level when the lease starts. On the commencement date, the lease might reference a £500 per annum ground rent, and then somewhere in the small print further down in your lease there'll be a review mechanism that doubles the ground rent every 5, 10, 15 years. Now, when people signed up to those leases, they may well have been aware of that situation at the time, but then flats have been sold on, and subsequent owners haven't necessarily been made fully aware of the implications, and the market perceptions changed, and lenders' requirements, more importantly, have changed on these ground rents. So lenders will not tolerate ground rents that double every 5, 10, 15 years. Some lenders have even more strict requirements where they don't want the frequency of the review to be less than more than every 5 years, or some even more than 12. So this is how the scandal started. Landlords and developers are writing leases that essentially bundle up massive amounts of ground rent that's payable over the term of the lease. Developers have, in fact, used this model to get what I term double bubble. So they build the development, they build out the development, so they sell the 5, 10, 20 flats in the building for top dollar, and then at the end of that, when the last flat's sold or extracted on the lease, they sell the freehold separately, and it's valued on the capital value of all those ground rents which they've written into the leases. So people in new build developments may get a Section 5 right of first refusal notice through their letterbox after a few months after they buy their flat, with referencing some enormous figure to buy their freehold, and that figure really equates to what level of ground rent the landlord's written into the leases. In extreme cases, the leaseholders in that building would have no chance of buying it, and that freehold interest is being sold off to a third party who's going to be looking at the potential in the rental income and in the management of the building, so that's something. That's the scandal. Essentially, you're buying something and then you're not getting the whole thing. The freehold interest is carved out with significant value, and it's sold off to someone else. Also, the contractual relationship is severed, so that developer may have arrangements or continuing arrangements under its contract for sale with the flat owners to deal with snagging, deal with issues with the landscaping or the external common parts, and the minute they sell the freehold and divest themselves from having any kind of assets, they can close the company down and avoid those hard obligations that maybe they've half completed, leaving people really with an expense, an unexpected expense. Reputable developers will not. So if you buy from a reputable developer, and if they do package up the freehold and sell it on, they usually do comply with the snagging list requirements, because of the reputation attached to not doing that. But if it's a small developer, I think you're in a fairly difficult situation. I think you'll find yourself not getting those things that are causing you problems completed, like maybe the communal gates or the entrance doorway, telecom systems not really operating in the way that you were sold, in the manner in which you were sold. So problems, and then of course you've got my view is that the ground rent scandal is not just attached to what developers have done in recent times when they're issuing leases of flats and houses with massive ground rents. It's also the second strand of this scandal is where people have a lease that has an onerous ground rent, and they approach the freeholder outside of the statutory regime, so outside of the 93 Act, where you try and write the ground rent out completely, and they try and agree a voluntary deal with the landlord to soften it up, and they swap the existing bad arrangement for potentially another bad arrangement. So if someone's selling their flat now, they're passing that problem on to the next guy, because maybe their £500 doubling ground rent's been changed to £500 increasing, by retail price index with complex review provisions, which will become unacceptable to mainstream lenders in the next 2, 3, 4 years' time, because we've seen that the lenders' requirements around ground rents and ground rent provisions that are ever changing, or maybe someone's just future-proofing their flat for sale, and they think, okay, if I just soften the ground rent provision up, I'll be all right. And then when they come to sell, they find they've got the same problem that they had, and then they find they've got to pay their freeholder another amount to rescue a sale, or to make their flat viable for sale. So it's got two strands. It's not just about what the developers have done, it's about these old existing leases where you've got unscrupulous freeholders who are just waiting for you to knock on the door, and they're going to offer you a soft solution to a problem which is not a solution. It's it's a bad apple lease. So what we recommend when clients come to us with these issues is, if there isn't, we will look at the informal voluntary deals that try and soften up the problem. But if we can't guarantee that it's going to be future-proof, you really need to look at exercising your 93 Act rights and extending the lease under statute. Now that leasehold reform right gives you the option of removing the ground rent entirely, and you'll not have this problem. And I think at the start of our day one, we mentioned about the government intervention and the Law Commission looking at these issues. And again, yes, the government have looked closely at ground rents, whether there's a need for it, whether it can abolish ground rent, completely from leases. Is that the right thing to do? You can only take a view on what the government might do. And I think my considered view on the direction of travel for the government is that ground rents will probably be abolished in new leases at some point, and that could well be 2-3 years from now, because of the amount of time it takes for legislation to come through. But is the government going to retrospectively tamper with arrangements leaseholders and freeholders have freely entered into, and which both parties have had full legal advice on? I just don't. I can't see that happening. But what I can see happening is maybe the government and the proposals that the Law Commission have come out with, and in implementing those proposals, is maybe capping the amount of ground rent that goes through the calculation when they're looking at what people should pay to remove these rents. So there may be some good news in the horizon for leaseholders, who aren't selling, who don't have a lease that's approaching that kind of magic 80-year mark. And maybe there is, maybe they can wait. Maybe they've got maybe they've got the luxury of time in their hands. But for people who are looking to sell, or their leases are approaching that magic 80-year mark where things become very expensive to extend, I don't think the Law Commission's reforms are going to be coming in time to help those people. And I think they have to look at really what they can do now to address the situation, because it's always cheaper to do it today rather than to wait till you're kind of at the mercy of mercy of your landlord, because you're desperate to sell and you've got to get the paper signed in the morning. You've got to get that deal done. That's when things get desperate and people they enter into bad deals. So people have to really think hard if they've got this if they've got an onerous ground rent. They have to think long and hard about whether they tackle it now, and that's the advice. Waiting just makes it a desperate situation.
I think that's very good advice, Ian, and I think this topic does need more awareness, because property is a long-term investment, and when you're thinking about purchasing a property, and maybe it's a new build and it's got one of these onerous leases, perhaps it doesn't sound that bad, but then when you actually start to add up the numbers, these leases can go from £500, the ground rents can go from £500 a year to kind of thousands, tens of £1,000s. And you've got to think about that when you come to exit, because it could actually affect your ability to sell the property, as you've rightly pointed out. I think what's also very interesting is that it was the lenders that really flagged up this issue. And there's things to consider with lenders if you're looking to finance a leasehold property, because they don't like leases under 80 years. They don't like flats that are in over 5 floors high. They have some issues if they there's oversaturation of flats in an area and they've lent on a lot of flats. So it's quite interesting that they're in the mix of this whole conversation.
Yeah, it's also, what we also look at, so the lenders have played a fairly key role in dictating what's acceptable and not acceptable. But there's also another consideration. You need to look at, where that flat's situated in London, what the market will tolerate for that flat. So, if you've got a flat in prime central London, £1,000 or £2,000 ground rent on a flat that's got £2 or £3 million value, that may not be considered an onerous ground rent. I mean, in fact, I think the law, the tribunal, it's kind of taken what is an onerous ground rent is about 0.1% of the capital value of the flat. So the current capital value of the flat. Some lenders will even lend up to 0.2%. So if you've got a very expensive flat in a nice area, higher ground rents are tolerated. But if you had that flat in Croydon, who would want to pay? So who would want to pay £1,000 or £2,000 per annum ground rent on a flat in Croydon that's not possibly worth, £300,000-400,000? It makes it untenable, and then there's the risk that you buy that. You're the unsuspecting purchaser, and you buy that flat. You can't afford the ground rent. It has doubled, and maybe it's gone up to a level which you can't afford. Then you're at risk of forfeiture. And the regulation and the cap on the regulation, the restriction on landlords taking action for forfeiture, they're very relaxed with ground rent. So, if you owe the freeholder more than £350, the landlord can take that route. Landlords don't need a determination from the first tier tribunal or a judgment to serve a 146 notice on ground rent. So. It's very dangerous. These ground rents, they're exceptionally dangerous. So, very, very good story in terms of my experience on one of these onerous ground rent cases was I had a client once who went to auction, and they bought a flat, put their hand up, and it didn't necessarily read the papers very well, but they bought the flat, and a few weeks later they had a letter from the freeholder seeking £15,000 in ground rent. That was the annual ground rent. It was based on the fact that lease. It wasn't a doubler. It was it had an old provision that valued the ground rent on the market vacant possession of the land which the property was situated on. So it was £15,000 according to the freeholder, and there was complex review provisions on it. And the lease terms are so bad, my advice to the client was to stick it back in auction. And she did. And she rang me up several weeks later and thanked me for that advice. Someone else bought it. So passing the problem on. But somebody will get to a point. Now, someone will get to the point where that's not, people at auction will pick up on this. People are, particularly now with the scandal being, in the news, there's been a massive amount of campaigning done on by leaseholder groups to try and abolish ground rents and to bring this issue, to build awareness on this. So it's not going to be that easy, in the current context, the current market, to just offload these flats and pass the problem on. That was a lucky client.
No, it's so interesting what this conversation is throwing up, because as soon as you said that property had been put into auction, I immediately thought, somebody was hoping that somebody would buy it that didn't actually understand this issue, and I think you've given us a very good tip there that buying property at auction, anagram of auction, is caution, and we'll probably see more of these kind of onerous ground rent properties turning up in auctions, hoping to pass the problem on to somebody else. But I think again the enduring theme of this week is you got to understand the provisions outlined in your lease, and you do need to seek legal advice on this issue. When any of these topics arise, you need to come to a specialist leasehold expert like Ian or one of the other members of ALEP, the Association of Leasehold Enfranchisement Practitioners, who can advise you on leasehold issues. But that is it for day 2 of our Leasehold Made Simple week. I think it is such a complex topic, Ian. We're trying to make it simple, but even my brain's a bit kind of frazzled.
We hate onerous ground rents at Anthony Gold. It's a nightmare for clients. Absolute nightmare.
But you're here to help.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, join us tomorrow as our Leasehold Made Simple week continues. We've got a lot more to come, and we're covering everything that you need to know about leasehold, and very important if you're thinking of leasehold as an investment, because there are these issues to consider for the future. So join us tomorrow.